Thank you. So a couple of weeks ago, on July 1st to be exact, Mr. Ken Bleakley came to visit us and we walked through the proposed procedures and policies for our newest tax allocation district number 3. So you'll see here in this presentation a date of July 1st. This is the presentation that we used initially to discuss those procedures and policies, which the council then did adopt. But we've had some follow-up questions regarding the advisory board. Okay, so one of the key elements of tax allocation district number 3 is the establishment of an advisory board. So just to recap very quickly, as you see here on the map, these are the boundaries of tax allocation district number 3. It consists of about 900 acres. We'll call it south of the hospital, if you will. Again, a little bit about our procedures and policies, but we wanted to take just some time to review this element of the advisory board. So we've invited Mr. Ken Bleakley, to come here again this evening and walk us through, because he's helped many communities set up tax allocation districts. But I think the most important thing that we want to convey this evening is that advisory board and what it is comprised of. So there's 5 members. One seat is to be held by the City of St. Mary's city manager or a designee. One seat is to be held by the City of St. Mary's community development director. 2 seats to be appointed by the city council. So as you'll see on this evening's agenda, the city clerk has announced a new board, the tax allocation district number 3 board, and there will be 2 openings. Ken can talk a little bit about what's recommended for those positions. And then lastly, you'll see here that one representative of the Camden County government to be appointed by the chairperson of the Camden County Commissioners. So they have appointed Mr. Joey Yakabachi, who is the planning director for the county. So with that, Ken, I'll ask you just to roll through.
Good evening. Good to see you all again.
Good evening.
Jamie had asked me specifically to talk about the advisory committee and how that would function. If you look around the state, and about half the TADs in the state, counties or cities have advisory committees and half they don't. So it's roughly about 50% of the time we see that. What we're proposing, and I think it's on 4, shown 4 there, as Jamie just said, that the advisory committee would have 5 members that we're proposing. It's interesting, the state legislation does not specify how the advisory committee be formed or how many members it has. This is all by, experience around the state over the last 20 years, how these have been developed. Some advisory committees are 20 and 25 people in larger cities. More commonly, we recommend a smaller group so that you get a small group of committed people who meet probably 3 or 4 times a year, really understand the process, and then as they see applications come in, they get experience of, oh, okay, I kind of know what the last one was like, I know what this is like, and they can ask really good questions and sort of focus in on things. The role of the advisory committee is, if you think about process, what's going to happen is if somebody has a project in TAD 3 and they want to bring a project forward, first thing they would do is go see Jamie and her staff and talk to them about the project. And at that point, she can say, gee, that doesn't sound like it meets our criteria, or yeah, that sounds like it might meet our criteria. Why don't you take it to the next level and make an application? They then make a formal application to seek funding, and that's something the staff would review and get back to them. In our experience, usually it's an incomplete application. They give you about half of what you need. So you go back, say, can you give me more information on this, or can you clarify that? And when they have a complete application, then they'll convene the advisory committee. And the advisory committee only meets when there's work to do. If there's no applications, you don't need to have it meet. I would say, probably 3 or 4 times a year would be the typical experience, but sometimes they meet once a year, and sometimes they'll meet a couple times when things are busy and then not meet again for 9 months. So you don't need to have a regular schedule. You basically respond to when applications come in. At that point, the advisory committee sits down and Jamie and her staff will present to them the project, what their take on the application is, how much the person's asking for, what they're going to use the money for, how it would basically operate. And typically the applicant also attends that meeting, and they'll make a brief presentation about their project and what they're planning to do with the money. And then at that point, the committee and Jamie will have the applicant leave the room, and they'll have a discussion, and usually out of that discussion then call back the applicant in and say, well, you have 3 choices. We accept your application as you wrote it, we reject your application as you wrote it, or we'd suggest some modifications. And a lot of times those modifications happen in the meeting. So they'll say, well, gee, we're all on board, we like this, but we want to do a little less. Would you accept X amount? Or we're interested in A, B, and C, but we don't want to do D. Would you go do those 3 things? And so there'll be an exchange. And then out of that process, basically you get a final application. You get it. If the project's going to move forward, you've got a package basically ready to go. And that's the package then that will go to city council for their approval. The advisory committee is just advisory. They can't commit the city or its dollars to the project. That only occurs by city council, because the city council is designated as the redevelopment agent for this process. So they're strictly advisory. But what we see happen is the cities that have these, it's an opportunity to basically organize and get the application in a format that council will have seen before, and they can look at and digest and say, okay, we answer all usual questions, yes, here's where we are, here's what they're requesting. And it saves the council a lot of time, because basically Jamie and her folks and the committee will do sort of a legwork to pull everything together in terms of the process. The work of the advisory committee is advisory. So if for some reason the advisory committee rejects it or modifies it, the applicant has the right to go to council and not accept those recommendations. In my experience, that very rarely happens. That what the advisory committee works with that applicant becomes the final application. I can't even think of an example where that hasn't been the case. So it usually works really well as a process. It's an ability to kind of bring things together and get to a place where council can look at it and say, okay, yay or nay, we think this is a good project for the tax allocation district. Let's see, what would be another good?
Can you speak a little bit to if the advisory board has terms? Like, is there a term of service? Or?
Yeah, that's really your call. Typically, there's no specified term, but you could set a term of 3 or 4 years or a couple of years and then reappoint those individuals. What we usually find is, because they don't meet that often, that people are willing to serve more than 1 year, because they're typically only going to meet 3 or 4 times during the course of the year. And they also experiences after they do it a couple times, they're like, okay, I got this and I know how to do it. I'm glad to participate and kind of bring my expertise from the previous applicants to the table. So we don't see a lot of turnover, but you can certainly say, our approach would be to do this every 3 years, say, either reappoint those individuals or open it to new individuals. Usually the county, the other thing we recommend is that anybody who is pledged revenue to your TAD, which in this case would be the county government, not the school board, have a seat on the advisory committee. And the reason is they're bringing substantial dollars to the table, and it helps them understand kind of how the TAD's being used. So if there are any issues in the future, it's still the city's decision. The city has the majority of the vote, but then there's somebody in that other jurisdiction who goes, no, I was at the meeting, I understood why we did what we did, and that project made sense, here's why we made that decision. We found that's paid huge dividends, both for the school board if they participate and for the county, to sort of be in the tent when those decisions are being made. But you have to make sure that the city has the majority of the vote, because you're the one that's taking the financial obligation. It's your commitment. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I kind of asked or suggested that we ought to have this type meeting, and as you know, this is different than the other two TADs that we've done, because now we
Yes.
have the advisory committee that is going to serve that and advise the council on how to do this work. But the question really centers around qualifications. We're asking for a review of some rather complex issues,
Yes.
financial, long-term, that can keep the, city on edge for a number of years with bond payments and things like that. And also with construction or those sorts of things, and maybe management efforts that a company brings forth in there. So have we thought about what type of qualifications we're going to look for? Because, as you know, and we've done that once on this council that I can think of, where you appointed somebody that wasn't qualified per the what they were looking for, and it was really hard for both the committee that was in question and also for the people that were on the committee, because they were overwhelmed and should not have been there in the first place. So we want to make sure we get this right when we do it and get the right type of people on this committee. So have we thought about that in this
Yeah.
process?
Absolutely, and our recommendation would be, one of the key things that we see, sometimes there's some confusion when the advisory committee gets set up, is they're not going to opine as to the architecture or the land use, zoning issues. All that gets dealt with in your normal zoning and land use approval process. So if you were on the committee and you said, boy, I really don't like that green trim on the front of the building, you can say that, that's totally if you want to voice that, but that's not the role of the TAD Advisory Committee. The TAD Advisory Committee is to say, does this meet our financial criteria and our purpose, or where we set the TAD up, and is it within those guidelines in terms of the kinds of projects we want to finance, and does the dollar amount seem appropriate given our policies? So it's really a more financial sort of construction, development-oriented thing than it would be architecture or review of zoning policy. That's going to happen separately. So typically what we see, the kind of folks who participate in this would be somebody who might be a local business person, has familiarity with financials, has worked with those. It could be a local accountant from an accounting firm. It could be a banker. It could be somebody from the chamber or from CVB, whatever. People who have sort of development activity as part of their mission, they're the ones that kind of quickly can get down, look at the deal and say, okay, why are you doing this way? When the applicant comes in, you want to ask them questions, they're often the most thoughtful people about, well, why aren't you paying for this, or why are we being asked to do this part, and basically sound out those ideas. So it's folks who have some development, economic development, financial background would be ideal.
Okay, so when we put the requirements together, we should include what we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to speak back to, from a community development standpoint, and this having a couple of conversations with some other cities that actually have put together these advisory boards, and there were kind of 6 different things that they had pointed to, and you had already spoke regarding the stakeholder engagement. For example, anyone that has a significant pledge of revenue involved in the TAD. So I think we understand the stakeholder piece. There's also, I think, we could probably work on the appointment process, but in the terms and responsibilities, the advice, or what I have actually have discussed with some other cities, is that they really said you really need to define the role and responsibility, so it's not just sort of broad, and to make sure, so that would be the terms, that would be, exactly what exactly we would be expecting of them, how long that term went, and then, obviously the difference between advising and then making development decisions. And so the other piece that they discussed was the meeting procedures, and then making sure that we had some pieces in place to make sure that there was transparency and accountability, because I think especially for a municipality of our size, we want to make sure that we keep our citizens informed right along the way. And they also mentioned perhaps having some way for them to be able to, obviously it's an open meeting, I'm guessing, so they'd be able to
Right.
participate in that open meeting.
Right. Right, and the key document is what becomes the actual application, and that's a public document. So when they make application for funding, that, typically gets revised as you go through the process, but that becomes sort of the public record of, here's what they're requesting, here's, what our reaction back to that was, and here's the usually there's a final version that comes out, and that's really what structures the ask, if you will, from the process. But
Right.
yeah, those are all good comments.
And we'll make sure that our attorney actually has a hand in putting together the, whichever we decide on.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
No. Been very well laid out. Very well laid out.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I think in the conversations that Ken and I have had, if I think about our technical review team that would review these types of applications, it's really that financing piece that I think we could use assistance with. If someone comes to us and says, this much housing, this much commercial retail square footage would yield this in terms of taxes, and I think we would just need that kind of acumen on the board.
Yeah, that's usually the key part of the negotiation is probably, if anything, we see the applicants overestimate how much increment they're going to generate. And so having either someone at the county help out or we could help out if it's a big complex project so that you say, yeah, does that seem in the ballpark? Because that's, if you overestimate that and don't generate that revenue, then the rest of the payouts don't work too good. So that's probably the numeric thing that's the biggest challenge.
So I guess my question then, the next question would be, because for most part, all of the TADs, you've pretty much done the financial projections, and so I'm imagining that we would also have that type of data for this advisory committee?
Yes.
Before or after?
Yeah,
Okay.
and the other good thing is you're doing a pay-as-you-go. So one of the clauses in your contract with them is if these results don't occur, you won't get the money. So you're protected, you're not committed to that dollar if they don't generate that dollar. And that's really your ultimate security. So, even if as good as we think we are, if we guessed wrong, you still have an out, which is if the assessor comes back and says, no, it's really not worth that, then that's the only increment you have to allocate. So,
Sure.
and that's the great thing about pay-as-you-go. You're not committed to a predetermined number.
Sure. Okay, any other?
I'd just say thanks for coming down and doing this again.
Yeah, I think you'll find this is a really good process. It's a little more cumbersome. Some communities, skip this and go through staff and just bring it to council. But what we've seen is when it works, particularly after a couple times through, it really streamlines the process and it gives the applicant somebody to bounce ideas and talk through things without the formality of, okay, I've got to get this exactly right at the final minute. So there's some room to negotiate, and then you get to a place that everybody's comfortable with and bring it forward. It's a good process. We recommend it to most communities.
Yeah, it is. You can see
Absolutely.
that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Anything else? No more questions? Well, then I will close this work session. Thank you all for coming. We will be back at 6 o'clock for our regularly scheduled meeting.
Take care.